Hello, I'm Michael Millum, Interim Pastor of Amazing Grace Lutheran Church in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and I hope you are blessed by the hearing and preaching of God's Word today. Brittany Bias was a remarkable young woman who grew up in my congregation in Connecticut. I was there, fortunately, long enough to be able to watch her to grow from a small child into a wonderful young woman. And she was very involved in the youth ministry of our congregation while she was in middle school and high school, and involved in the church as well. She sang in the adult choir, and she accompanied us on many of the mission trips we made during the summer while she was growing up in our congregation. And she was somebody, once you knew her, you realized, who would never be able to embrace the art of traveling light. I find it very interesting to kind of compare the things that we would take on our mission trips with the instructions that Jesus gives to his disciples today when he sends them out on a mission. They are to go out without anything but the clothes on their back and their sandals, not even any money. In the latter years of these mission trips, we would tow a 12-foot trailer behind a big diesel truck, and that trailer would be filled from top to bottom and front to back with all the tools we would take with us for the work. These mission trips usually involved going to another state and another city where we would work for a week refurbishing homes for the elderly and low-income families. So we would have all these tools with us. But the majority of the space was taken up with the luggage that these kids brought along with them, especially the teenage girls like Brittany. They had to have a minimum of 2 changes of clothing every day. And then, of course, after a day of working in the hot sun, we would get back to the school that was hosting us, and everybody would shower, and then they had to have their makeup so they could look good for the boys, and all the hair products and the lotions. Brittany brought not just an air mattress or a cot with her, she brought a canopy cot. Believe it or not. I kid you not. She had a cot that was raised up and it had this netting that went over it. It was like a princess bed, and I could never figure out why on earth this teenage girl needed to have this princess bed with her on a mission trip, of all things. You know, the boys were different. There were days when I couldn't even get the boys to shower after a day of working in the hot sun. But the girls had to have everything along with them. And of course, Jesus instructs the disciples not to take money. We had money with us. We had money to pay the tolls on the toll roads. The kids would bring money to buy food on the trip to and from the location where we were going to be working. They had money for our midweek day off. We got half a day off on Wednesdays, and we would always go and do something fun, so they had to have money for that. Money to buy souvenirs at the store, at the school at night, and food and snacks. And so we all had plenty of money with us. And then, of course, there was the electronic devices that they had to bring. You know, in the early days, it was the iPod and the Game Boy. And those, of course, eventually became obsolete. And you could do everything on your phone. So everybody had a smartphone with them. But there weren't enough outlets in the school classrooms where we were sleeping for everybody to keep their electronic devices charged and ready for use. Jesus, in today's gospel reading, clearly is expecting the disciples to shed all of that. They are supposed to rely upon God to provide for them on this mission trip. And they are to rely on the hospitality of strangers to welcome them into their homes and to feed them. So Jesus sends them out without any of the stuff that we would ordinarily feel like we needed for comfort and security to be able to go on a journey somewhere. And I dare say the majority of us here probably would not respond positively to the idea of going on the kind of mission that Jesus sends his disciples on today. We all carry baggage with us, don't we? And that baggage very often will weigh us down and make it difficult for us to react and respond to the situations in life, and especially to the call that Jesus makes on our lives. So what is our baggage? What are we carrying around with us? As we acknowledged in our confession at the beginning, often it's guilt and remorse, which can be quite paralyzing. We feel that we are unworthy and unable to answer the call of God to do the work that God is calling us to do. It can be our money and our material possession, our homes, relationships, family members, spouses. All of these things can be inhibitors to our response to God's call into mission. This is true of us as individuals and as a church. When I went into ministry over 30 years ago now, I did things the easy way. It didn't seem like it at the time, but upon reflection, it was, for me, rather easy. I went right from college into seminary, and right from seminary into full-time ministry. There were no encumbrances. I wasn't married at the time. I did begin dating Deb while I was in seminary, and we got married right before my last year, but we didn't have any children at that point in time. So it was relatively easy. There weren't a lot of distractions or things to interfere with the goal of answering God's call into ministry. But there was a phenomenon that was occurring at that time when I was in seminary of people coming into ministry later in life. We called them second career people. And in fact, at this point in time, more than 50% of the people who are going into full-time ministry in our church are what we call second career folks. These are people who come to the call of Christ later on in life. In many cases, they are married, they've been raising children, they have a home, and they've had other careers, some of them quite lucrative careers. So they shed all of that in order to answer God's call into ministry. Many of them are engineers, doctors, lawyers. We have some women who are homemakers, but they all were used to a rather comfortable and secure, financially stable lifestyle. And they have to shed a good deal of that in order to answer that call and return to go back to school again, to seminary, in order to enter a vocation that in most cases is going to pay them half of what they were earning in their previous profession. And there sometimes are other casualties along the way. As you can imagine, uprooting a family plays havoc with the family and with marriages. In some cases, while I was in seminary, I knew folks who came there married, and their spouses eventually said to them, well, God may have called you to this, but he didn't call me, and the marriage ended. So whether intentionally or unintentionally, many of these folks had to learn to travel light in order to respond to God's call to be in ministry. And we have some of the same things that weigh us down in the church too, don't we? We have many things that we are very attached to that we wind up spending most of our time and energy on rather than answering the call to outreach and mission. Early in the month of June, Perry and Lisa Moss, Bob and Elaine Schwartz, and I went to Synod Assembly, which we do every year, or I do every year anyway. And Synod Assembly is something that I have always hated to love and loved to hate. Because, it can be a good thing for somebody who's never been, because it gives you tremendous insight into the activity and involvement of our church and all the good that the church does in the 4 states that make up our synod here and around the world as well. But it also gives you a bird's eye view into how top-heavy and institutional our church is and all of the denominational baggage that we sometimes carry around with us that I think encumbers us, because people in our society today don't like institutions. They're distrustful of institutions, and when a church appears to be very top-heavy and institutional, they don't want anything to do with it. And this is what we were talking about at dinner one night. And this is why people don't like to hang around with the pastor. Because inevitably, you end up talking about theology and church matters that ordinarily nobody cares about except the pastor. And so that night at dinner we were talking about church traditions and doctrines. You know, real scintillating dinner time conversation. And Perry, who was kind of new to this, certainly was new to Synod Assembly, was asking me, so where did we get all this stuff? All this stuff that we say and do? Where did it come from? And I answered him and said, well, some of it came down from the Pope, from church councils, and many of the practices and traditions that we still engage in as Lutherans was handed down to us from Martin Luther. So he said, so none of this goes all the way back to Jesus? And I said, well, except for the Lord's Supper, no, most of it doesn't. And earlier that evening, the bishop had preached a sermon during our worship service in which he held up one of those plastic arm bracelets with the acronym WWJD stamped on it, something he had been given years before. And of course, as most of you probably know, WWJD stands for What Would Jesus Do? And so Perry again looked at me and said, what would Jesus do? Well, quite frankly, I don't think he would care about most of this stuff. And I didn't say anything to him out loud, but I was thinking in my mind, amen, brother. We are very top-heavy as a church, institutional, denominational, and that's baggage that we carry around with us that oftentimes people find distrustful and they don't respond well to. So what is the baggage that we carry around? We're all so attached to our buildings and our mortgages, to our budgets, to our fears and worries that we won't be able to keep enough giving members in our congregation to keep the doors open and the lights turned on. And wouldn't it be wonderful for us to be free of all of that, from those concerns, so that we could be leaner without being meaner and be more agile in responding to God's call and mission, rather than spending most of our time worrying about how to keep things here afloat and stable and solid. Then, of course, there are the traditions that we feel are inviolable in the church. And, of course, there's only one way to do things, right? It's the way we've always done it. Now, how do we begin to decide what baggage to shed, to discard? Well, in keeping with today's gospel reading, it seems to me that the standard ought to be, what is it that helps us in responding to God's call to ministry? Now, most of our traditions served a very important purpose at one point in time, but over time it has come to the point that they no longer do. So if it's not going to support the mission that we have been given as a people, then we don't need it anymore, folks, no matter how attached we are to it. And some of them actually inhibit our ability to respond to Christ's call. There was a visiting pastor who traveled out to a rural congregation, a tiny church, to preach while the pastor was on vacation. And the service began the way most all of our services do, with an organ prelude, and then the visiting pastor was sort of half tuned in and realized that after the prelude was over with, the organist had gone into a little ditty and was playing it. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, na, na, happy birthday to you, and then segued immediately into the opening hymn. And the visiting pastor was very puzzled by this, and after the service was over with, had to approach the organist to ask why it was she played the happy birthday song before playing the music for the opening hymn. And the organist thought about it for a bit and couldn't answer the question. Obviously, it was a tradition that was begun a while back, many years ago, and it must have served a purpose. She'd been doing it ever since she had been playing organ in that church, and she never questioned it. It was just something that she did every week, but she couldn't tell you why. I once read a story about a missionary family, an American missionary family in China, who were placed under house arrest in the early 1980s. And they spent months waiting for some word as to what was going to happen to them. And eventually, officials contacted them to tell them that they were going to be expelled from China, but they would be allowed to return to the United States safely. In fact, they were going to be leaving the very next day, and they were told they could only bring 500 pounds with them on their trip back home. So the family, the parents and the children, spent the whole evening deliberating and debating, sometimes rather heatedly, as to what they were going to take with them when they left. The next day, soldiers arrived at the house to escort them away from the dwelling that had been their home and to begin their journey back to the United States. And the soldiers asked, "Did you decide what you're going to take with you?" And the missionary and his wife said, "Yes, it was a difficult decision, but we chose what we were going to bring along with us." And then the soldier said, "Well, did you weigh the children?" And they said, "No, we didn't know that we had to do that." And the soldier said, "Weigh the children." Stories like our gospel reading this morning and this one I just told you, I think, commend to us the value of traveling light, of being able to decide what is truly important, what really matters, so that we can travel light and respond to the call when it comes to us, to be agile and be ready to get up and move when God gives us the word.